Hey guys, what's up and welcome to the Philosopher's Historia, my brand new history channel where I'll be talking about all things history. For this first episode, I want to talk about the Russian revolutions of 1917, a key point in Russian history that didn't just bring down the end to the monarchy, but also led to the creation of the Soviet Union, which would forever define the rest of Russia's history in the 20th century, but the 20th century as a whole. But for us to understand why the revolutions of 1917 occurred, we need to go back and talk about the events that led for such revolutions to happen. By the early 20th century, the Russian Empire ruled far and wide, being one of the largest empires of its time. However, this empire was on the verge of collapsing for decades. The empire was ruled by the Tsar and or Tsarina, who in other words were kings and queens of Russia, but unlike the British Empire, who during the 19th century was not completely bound by a controlling monarchy, and due to that was able to thrive and progress. The Russian Empire by all accounts was practically a feudal state, and the Tsar had complete power. Serfdom was what the Russian Empire practiced, a form of feudalism where people who didn't own land were forced to obey and serve the nobility. Serfdom would be abolished in 1861, and the lower class had more of a free will to speak out against the system. Serfdom wasn't the only thing holding Russia back. The monarchy was incredibly arrogant and out of touch as Russia was falling behind in the Industrial Revolution, leading to other powers becoming more advanced, and with this enriching their empires into the modern era. Russia also suffered through many losses in the 19th century, most notably the Crimean War, which only made Russia look even more weak and outdated, losing its influence in the Black Sea. Russia also suffered loads of famines due to a lack of food, which was hard to harvest in Russia's colder climate, and thanks to Russia's losses on the global stage, would make the empire poorer and poorer. This would lead to Russia's most embarrassing loss yet in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Japan, a country people didn't take so seriously at the time, ended up beating a Western European power. It was a complete shock to everybody and a complete embarrassment to the Russian Empire. The Russian people were sick and tired of the neglect, especially because of the war with Japan. All these events made the people led by Georgy Gapan, a radicalist priest, to march over to the Imperial Winter Palace to confront the Tsar and his government to try and talk and make them reform. It wasn't even a violent protest, but unfortunately these people were met with violence back. This sparked the Russian Revolution of 1905. In which the people of Russia went on strike and protested against the Tsar. Many of these protesters would create a Council of Soviet made up of the empire's workers who wanted change, though they would be suppressed for the time being. The 1905 revolution would flop, but it wouldn't be a complete failure because it prompted Tsar Nicholas II to create a Russian parliament, which is known as the Duma, turning Russia more into the direction of a constitutional monarchy. But unfortunately, things would only get worse. This brings us to 1914, the year the Great War began, in which Russia was heavily involved and was part of the Entente, turning enemies once allies and allies once enemies. We all shame Italy for their performance in World War II, but the Russian Empire was not any better in the Great War. Russia's involvement initially in the Great War was supported, but became highly unpopular as time went on. The reason Russia even joined the war was to save their fellow Slavic ally, Serbia, from Austria-Hungary. Russia suffered huge losses in the war against the Central Powers, and conditions for the army and population was terrible, from more economic issues to more food shortages, and to fund the war, massive inflation, leading to more strikes, and the growth of the revolutionary parties. Sad thing is, Tsar Nicholas II was actually in the war and took command of the army in 1915, an army that was no match for the highly industrialized Germany, who had better technology. The Tsar's absence made things even crazier as, without the Tsar in Russia's capital, his wife Tsarina Alexandra took the helm. The problem with this was Alexandra was a woman of German ancestry and in general was highly unpopular, especially as she was under the influence of Grigory Rasputin, who, let's just say, was a very controversial figure, from manipulations, scandals, and heresy. but the monarchy trusted him for healing Alexei, who was their son, from his illness. Yeah, he had healing abilities, some would say. Rasputin eventually would be murdered in 1916, which that in of itself is a whole weird story. At this point, there was no hope left for the Russian Empire. So, on March 8, 1917, the first of the 1917 Russian revolutions would begin, known as the February Revolution. This started from more protests about food shortages and poor working conditions, and more would fill the streets of Petrograd, which was the capital of the Russian Empire and was originally named St. Petersburg, but because it sounded too German, it was renamed to Petrograd during the Great War. As the days went by, more and more would continue to join the protests, and Tsar Nicholas II, hearing this, would contact General Kovalov to suppress the revolts with force. However, many troops refused the orders and would join with the protests. This meant Nicholas was pretty much losing practically all support from the people, the Duma, and now the military. Under the advice of his ministers, as well as being trapped in the city of Pskov on a train back to Petrograd, would be forced to abdicate on March 15, 1917, marking the end of the Russian Empire and the end of the monarchy. Nicholas had hoped his brother Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich would take the throne, but Michael refused without consent from an elected constitutional assembly. A few days before the abdication, the provisional government would be created on March 12th by the State Duma. This provisional government tried to fix a lot of the issues Russia had been faced, but was still seen as deeply unpopular, and made to still serve the corrupt elites. They also had to share power with the Petrograd Soviet, who were made up of workers and soldiers of the city. The provisional government struggled in its legitimacy from the far more popular Petrograd Soviet, especially as the provisional government failed to address the ruined economy, food shortages, and the losing battle of the Great War. Oh, and the provisional government, because of the geniuses they are, decided to stay in the Great War, which was probably one of the worst things, if not the worst thing, they could have done to have garnered the people's support, as the people were against Russia's involvement, and so it made them look even worse. Now, to understand the Second Revolution of 1917, we need to talk about the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks were radical Marxists who believed that the working class of Russia should seize control of the state and create a classless society. In other words, communists. After the February Revolution, Lenin, who was previously exiled in Switzerland, returned to Russia with Germany's help and issued the April Theses, created by Lenin to denounce the provisional government and call for all power to be given to the Soviets. Lenin and his Bolshevik cause would only grow with the events of the July Days, which was an even more violent protest of sailors, soldiers, and factory workers going against the provisional government, which led to the crackdown of the Bolshevik Party, with many leaders of the party being arrested or fleeing the nation, which was a temporary stunt in the growth of Bolshevism. And then you also had the events of the Kornilov Affair, which was yet another revolt by the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, Vladimir Kornilov, against the provisional government, which also failed. Following the failures of Kornilov, Alexander Kerensky, minister chairman of the provisional government, proclaimed the Russian Republic on September 14, 1917. This would completely disregard the Constitutional Assembly, which would decide the new government of Russia, and with them disregarding it, the provisionals would stay in power, making many Russians very upset, and elevating the opposition parties like the Bolsheviks to gain more traction. This led to the Bolsheviks becoming the overall majority in the Soviet of Petrograd and Moscow. This would lead to Leon Trotsky, another member of the Bolsheviks, to become chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. Lenin, still in exile in Finland due to the events of the July Days, urged the Bolsheviks to start a revolution as soon as possible, which led to much pushback, believing Lenin to be scared, and they also believed the Bolsheviks should push for the Constitutional Assembly. Many Soviets also preferred to wait for the Second Congress of Soviets, which would become the governing body of the future Soviet Russia. Right before the October Revolution, Trotsky, with support of the Petrograd Soviet, created the MRC, a revolutionary military committee created to oversee their right guards in the city, just in case any military force against the Soviets occurred. The Red Guards would continue to grow and their activities spread like wildfire. Yet Kerensky and his government did nothing, which was absolutely appalling, but Kerensky would finally take action and signed an arrest warrant for members of the MRC. His troops raided buildings, destroying all communist propaganda. The Bolsheviks, seeing this, didn't really know how to respond. Many thought they underestimated the provisional government, but it wouldn't take long to decide because on November 7, 1917, the Bolsheviks would officially launch the October Revolution. The Red Guards fought through the city, getting control of many important government buildings, the culmination being the Winter Palace, former home of the Tsar and now the seat of the provisional government. By now, Lenin had returned from Finland and Kerensky fled, heading to the front lines of the war to gain troops for his cause. However, that would not matter as the Bolsheviks assaulted the palace. The palace was bombarded with artillery while the Bolsheviks moved in. The troops stationed to protect the palace had low morale and belief in the fight, so many just joined the Soviets while others fled. The palace would be vandalized heavily from destroying art or looting. During this time, the Second Congress of Soviets occurred, with many such as the Mensheviks opposing the violence of the Bolsheviks, as they believed a more peaceful resolution. They debated, but the Mensheviks and other non-Bolsheviks left the Congress, which only gave the Bolsheviks total control of the Soviet. Eventually, the Red Guards would take control and capture the Winter Palace, and the remaining members of the provisional government. With this, the Bolsheviks eliminated the provisional government, and with the end of the Second Congress of Soviets, which would end on November 9th, would mean the establishment of a new communist government. Though they didn't have all of Russia on their side, and that would lead to civil war.